In the spring of 1874, when lilacs perfumed the hedgerows of Surrey and polished carriages lined the gravel before Whitmore House, Miss Eliza Whitmore learned how swiftly a young woman's future could be reduced to a whisper. Beneath chandeliers bright as captured constellations, she stood at the edge of the ballroom, gloved hands folded with deliberate composure, while the music swelled and society pretended not to stare. She had once been the evening's quiet ornament, admired for her restraint, envied for her grace, but tonight the glances cast in her direction were sharpened, curious, and unkind. Mrs. Lydia Whitmore, her stepmother, moved through the throng with the elegance of a general surveying conquered ground. Silk rustled at her command, fans fluttered in subtle agreement. She paused near clusters of matrons whose pearls lay heavy upon judgmental throats and allowed her voice, low, regretful, artfully burdened, to drift just far enough. "It grieves me to confess," she murmured, "that youthful imagination may sometimes overstep its bounds." The words required no explanation. They traveled like sparks across dry tinder. Eliza felt the heat of those sparks without hearing every syllable. She sensed the alteration in the air, conversations tapering as she approached, laughter dying prematurely, partners reconsidering their invitations. Only that morning she had believed her modest courtship with Mr. Harland, respectable, cautious, almost tender, would conclude in an engagement. Now Mr. Harland avoided her gaze entirely, his shoulders stiff with the righteousness of a man who prefers scandal to courage. When at last he did approach, it was not to offer reassurance but dismissal. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing with rigid civility, "certain revelations have obliged me to reconsider the direction of my attentions." The orchestra played on, but Eliza heard only the hollow echo of his phrasing. Revelations. As though her character were a locked cabinet he had been forced to open. "I wish you every felicity," he concluded, retreating before she might reply. She did not plead. She inclined her head, because dignity was the final possession she retained. Yet as he withdrew, a murmur rippled outward, subtle and triumphant. Mrs. Whitmore's hand settled briefly upon her own daughter Clara's shoulder, positioning her beneath the brightest light. Clara, prettily anxious, received fresh compliments like bouquets placed in careful succession. The contrast required no commentary. By the time the final waltz dissolved into applause, Eliza's reputation had been rearranged beyond repair. She was accused, never directly, always delicately, of encouraging affections with unseemly haste, of composing letters too ardent for propriety, of attempting to secure a proposal through artifice rather than virtue. No proof was demanded. In that room, suggestion was sufficient. The carriage ride home unfolded in suffocating silence. Mrs. Whitmore regarded the darkened countryside with composed severity before speaking. "You will appreciate," she began, "that the preservation of this family's standing must supersede individual sentiment." Eliza kept her gaze upon her clasped hands. "I have not acted dishonorably," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor gathering beneath it. "Truth is seldom the concern," her stepmother answered coolly. "Appearance is." Within days Eliza's world contracted to the uppermost chamber of Whitmore House. The attic, once a place of discarded trunks and forgotten portraits, became her appointed refuge under the guise of convalescence. Servants carried up a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair. Her pianoforte was removed, its absence echoing more loudly than any accusation. Windows were fastened to prevent drafts. The gesture felt less like protection than containment. From that height she could hear life continuing below. Clara practicing scales she had never mastered, Mrs. Whitmore receiving callers with measured regret, the clatter of china during afternoon tea. Eliza was instructed not to appear. Letters addressed in her hand were intercepted for correction. Invitations ceased entirely. She understood then that exile need not require distance. It required only silence. And yet silence for Eliza had never meant emptiness. Deprived of conversation and music, she turned to ink. Night after night she sat beneath the slanted roof, candlelight trembling against the beams, and allowed her thoughts to gather upon the page. She did not write to Mr. Harland, whose absence had already begun to resemble inevitability. She wrote instead to an unnamed reader, perhaps to Providence itself, shaping the ache in her chest into sentences of lucid restraint. "If there exists beyond these rafters," she penned, "a mind unclouded by rumor, I should like to believe it might recognize me, not as the figure described in drawing rooms, but as I am when unobserved. I have erred only in trusting that sincerity required no defense." Each word steadied her. Each line reclaimed a fragment of self the ballroom had attempted to confiscate. Days blurred into one another, marked by the slow arc of light across the floorboards. Mrs. Whitmore visited only once, her expression composed as ever. Reflection, she advised, surveying the sparse chamber, is often beneficial to young ladies inclined toward excess feeling. Eliza met her gaze without flinching. Feeling, ma'am, she replied softly, is not excess. It is merely inconvenient. The exchange altered nothing outwardly, yet something within Eliza shifted. Shame had arrived like a storm. Now it settled into a clearer, colder resolve. If she must inhabit the attic, she would not allow it to define her. She folded the completed letter with care and searched for a place beyond interception. In the corner lay a battered volume of sermons long ignored. She slipped the pages inside, trusting obscurity more than locks. That evening, clouds gathered with unusual haste, pressing low against the roof as though intent upon entry. Wind threaded through the eaves, rattling the fragile panes. Eliza lay awake, listening to the house groan beneath the assault, wondering whether even timbers resented confinement. A sudden crack split the darkness. Somewhere above, a section of slate shifted under strain. She rose, heart quickened, and crossed to the window just as rain lashed the glass. The attic trembled, not violently but insistently, as though urging movement where none had been permitted. On the floor near the bookshelf, the sermon volume tipped, jarred by the vibration. Eliza watched as it fell open, her hidden letter loosening from its refuge. A draft, born of storm and splintered seam, caught the paper's edge. It lifted, hesitant, defiant, and slid toward a thin fissure newly carved along the beam. Eliza reached forward, fingertips grazing empty air, as the letter vanished through the crack and into the restless night beyond. By morning, the storm had passed, but its consequences lingered like a held breath not yet released. The torn seam in the attic roof admitted a pale shaft of light, illuminating dust suspended in the air like drifting ash. Eliza stood beneath it, staring at the narrow fissure through which her letter had escaped, uncertain whether to mourn its loss or fear its discovery. It had been the only honest testament she possessed, a quiet declaration of existence. Now it belonged to the indifferent world below. That same dawn, a carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest struggled along the rain-softened road bordering Whitmore lands. His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, sat within, gloved hands resting upon a cane he scarcely required but carried as habit. Recently returned from London to settle matters of inheritance following his elder brother's untimely death, he had little patience for provincial pleasantries. Duty, not diversion, had drawn him home. His steward rode ahead, intent upon inspecting a section of boundary wall rumored damaged by the storm. When the carriage jolted to a halt near Whitmore House, the Duke stepped down to survey the fallen debris scattered across the verge. A fragment of slate lay near the hedgerow, and beside it, caught against a bramble, a single folded sheet of paper, damp but intact. He bent to retrieve it, meaning only to clear the path. Yet the weight of ink upon parchment arrested him. The handwriting was deliberate, elegant without ornamentation. He read the first lines with detached curiosity, then with growing attention. If there exists beyond these rafters a mind unclouded by rumor, the phrasing bore neither hysteria nor artifice. It carried restraint sharpened by injustice. He continued, rainwater trailing from his cuff unnoticed. The letter spoke of silence imposed, of dignity misinterpreted as ambition, of a longing not for rescue but recognition. The Duke folded the page slowly. He had encountered countless declarations during his years in society, pleas for patronage, calculated affection, flattery disguised as sincerity. This was different. Its author neither begged nor accused. She simply asserted truth with a steadiness that unsettled him. He glanced toward Whitmore House, its windows shuttered in polite symmetry, and felt an unfamiliar stirring of curiosity. Within hours, Mrs. Whitmore received word that His Grace might call to discuss storm damage affecting shared acreage. Her satisfaction was immediate and strategic. Clara's hair was arranged with meticulous softness. Fresh flowers were ordered despite the recent gale. No mention was made of Eliza, whose absence had already been woven into the household's new narrative of delicate indisposition. When the Duke entered the drawing-room that afternoon, he carried himself with composed reserve. Mrs. Whitmore greeted him with measured warmth, lamenting the weather and its inconveniences while deftly guiding conversation toward her daughter's accomplishments. Clara performed a hesitant pianoforte piece, missing notes that seemed to echo too loudly in the room's polished hush. The Duke listened politely, yet his attention drifted toward the upper corridor where a door stood conspicuously closed. "Your household appears diminished," he observed casually when the music ceased. Mrs. Whitmore's smile did not falter. "My stepdaughter suffers a nervous complaint," Youthful sensibilities can be fragile. Nervousness, he replied, his tone even, is often provoked rather than inherited. The remark hovered between them, neither accusation nor absolution. Clara looked uncertain. Mrs. Whitmore adjusted her bracelets with faint impatience. The Duke allowed the silence to settle before returning to matters of land and repair. Yet when he departed, the letter remained in his inner pocket, its presence more compelling than any boundary dispute. That evening, beneath the lamplight of his study, he read it again. The words seemed to acquire greater resonance in solitude. He imagined the attic implied by its opening line, the narrow window, the disciplined handwriting formed under constraint. Whoever she was, she possessed a mind unwilling to surrender itself to confinement. He found that quality arresting. Impulsively, though not without calculation, he selected a volume from his shelves, a collection of Milton's poems bound in understated leather. Inside the cover he placed a small card bearing a single sentence, "To the author whose voice the storm refused to silence." No signature accompanied it. He instructed his valet to deliver the book to Whitmore House with no explanation beyond courtesy. Mrs. Whitmore intercepted the parcel before it reached any unintended recipient. Her brows knit at the inscription. Suspicion flickered. "A charitable gesture," she murmured, though the lack of explicit address unsettled her. After a moment's consideration, she sent it upstairs under the guise of diversion for convalescence. If Eliza believed herself pitted, so much the better. When the book was placed upon the attic chair, Eliza regarded it as one might regard an apparition. The binding was unblemished, the edges precise. She opened it cautiously and discovered the card nestled within. The message struck her with a force that rendered her briefly unsteady. Someone had read her words. Not mocked them, not distorted them, but answered them. For the first time since the ballroom's humiliation, warmth replaced the chill of isolation. She traced the sentence with reverent fingers, absorbing its implication. The storm had not destroyed her confession, it had delivered it. Beyond these rafters existed not merely a mind unclouded by rumor, but one attentive enough to respond. Below, Mrs. Whitmore received an invitation to dine at Ashbourne Hall the following week. Clara's prospects brightened instantly in her estimation. Yet upstairs, Eliza sat beside the narrow window, the Milton volume resting against her heart, and allowed herself a fragile, dangerous thought, that destiny might possess a patience greater than malice. Across the fields, the Duke stood at his study window, watching dusk settle over the Whitmore estate. He did not know her face, nor her circumstances, yet the cadence of her writing had already altered the rhythm of his thoughts. Society prized spectacle. He had discovered substance. As twilight deepened, a single lamp flickered to life in the attic window, faint but unmistakable against the darkening sky. The Duke's gaze fixed upon it, an unspoken recognition passing between distance and light, as though the house itself had answered him in kind. The invitation to dine at Ashbourne Hall arrived with a flourish of wax and expectation, and Mrs. Whitmore accepted it as though destiny itself had extended a gloved hand toward her daughter. Clara's gowns were aired and altered, jewels selected with strategic restraint. Eliza was not mentioned. Yet beneath the rehearsed civility of preparation, an unease threaded through the household, subtle as a draught beneath a door. The Duke had not extended the invitation from impulse alone. Since the night he had seen the solitary lamp burning in the attic window, its quiet persistence against the dark had settled into his thoughts with unusual gravity. He had made inquiries, discreet, precise, about the Whitmore family. Rumor proved abundant, but facts proved curiously thin. The supposed indiscretion attributed to Miss Eliza Whitmore lacked witness, lacked substance, lacked everything save repetition. He understood then that silence could be engineered as deliberately as scandal. On the evening of the dinner, rain threatened but did not fall. The Whitmore carriage approached Ashbourne Hall beneath a sky heavy with restraint. Clara descended first, her smile tremulous yet hopeful. Mrs. Whitmore followed, composure restored to perfection. The Duke received them with impeccable courtesy, his expression betraying nothing of the private curiosity that sharpened his gaze. Eliza remained in the attic, informed only that the household would return late. She sat beside the narrow window with Milton open upon her lap, though she had not turned a page in some time. The card's inscription had become less an artifact and more a question. Who had seen her words? Who had believed them worthy of response? Hope, once awakened, refused to retreat entirely into obedience. At Ashbourne Hall, conversation flowed with polished ease. Mrs. Whitmore praised the Duke's management of his estates. Clara offered observations rehearsed to sound spontaneous. The Duke listened with attentive detachment. When at last he spoke of Whitmore House, his tone remained neutral. "I noticed a light burning late in your uppermost window," he remarked casually. "Storm damage, perhaps?" Mrs. Whitmore's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her wineglass. "A minor inconvenience," she replied. "My stepdaughter has been advised to rest in seclusion. Sensibilities, as I mentioned before, can be delicate." "Delicacy," the Duke returned evenly, "is often mistaken for fragility." The exchange lingered, weighted with implication. Clara glanced between them, uncertainty dimming her practiced brightness. Mrs. Whitmore shifted the conversation swiftly, yet the Duke's interest had sharpened into resolve. He would no longer content himself with inference. The following morning, under pretense of assessing shared land repairs, he rode to Whitmore House unannounced. The servants, startled by his arrival, scrambled to receive him. Mrs. Whitmore descended the staircase with composed astonishment. "Your Grace, had we expected you?" "Spontaneity often reveals what preparation conceals," he replied with a courteous inclination of his head. "Might I inspect the upper corridor where the storm struck? I prefer to understand the extent of structural concern personally." Refusal would appear suspicious. Consent felt perilous. After a fractional hesitation, she acquiesced. The corridor above lay hushed, sunlight filtering through a narrow window at its end. Dust lingered in the air, unsettled by footsteps seldom permitted. The Duke approached the closed attic door with measured calm. "Surely there is no necessity," Mrs. Whitmore began. "I assure you," he said quietly, "necessity rarely announces itself in advance." He opened the door. Eliza rose at once from the small writing desk improvised beside her bed. Surprise flashed across her features, followed by composure reclaimed through sheer will. She had imagined many futures in her confinement. None had included this figure framed in her doorway, tall and deliberate, bearing the unmistakable authority of his station. For a suspended moment, neither spoke. The room was modest, stripped of ornament, yet touched by care. Books stacked neatly, a shawl folded with precision, the Milton volume resting within reach. The Duke took in these details as one might read marginalia in a beloved text. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion," he said at last, his voice low but resonant. "I wish to confirm that the storm had not caused you injury." Eliza inclined her head. "The roof endured better than expectation, Your Grace. As I trust shall I." Her steadiness unsettled him more than tears would have. Mrs. Whitmore lingered at the threshold, her presence a reminder of surveillance. The Duke stepped further into the room, narrowing the space between himself and the woman whose words had first reached him through rain. "I believe," he said, meeting Eliza's gaze directly, "that I am acquainted with your handwriting." The color rose faintly in her cheeks, not from shame but recognition. "Then my thoughts have trespassed beyond their intended boundary." "On the contrary," he replied. "They traveled precisely where they were required." Mrs. Whitmore interjected sharply, "Your Grace, I cannot imagine what correspondence you imply." He did not turn toward her. "I imply sincerity, madam, and I find it rarer than rumor." Silence thickened. Eliza's pulse quickened, yet her expression remained composed. The Duke withdrew the folded letter from his coat and held it between them, not as accusation but as acknowledgment. "You wrote of existing only when unobserved," he said quietly. "I assure you, Miss Whitmore, I observe you now." Emotion flickered across her features. Astonishment, relief, a dawning courage she had not permitted herself to feel. "Observation," she answered carefully, "is a privilege seldom granted without distortion." "Then allow me," he replied, his gaze unwavering, "to be free of distortion." Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, her composure fracturing. "This is highly irregular." "Justice often is," the Duke said evenly. In that confined space, beneath the slanted roof that had once symbolized erasure, a subtle transformation occurred. Eliza was no longer merely the subject of whispers. She stood as the author of her own account, witnessed and affirmed. The central conflict, silence imposed versus truth asserted, had shifted from secrecy to confrontation. The Duke returned the letter to her hands. "If you would consent," he said, "I should like to hear the remainder of your story spoken, not stolen by wind." Hope, fragile yet undeniable, stirred fully awake within her. She met his gaze without retreat. Outside the door, Mrs. Whitmore's expression hardened into something colder than resentment. For the first time since the ballroom, control was no longer hers alone. The days following the Duke's visit unfolded with the deceptive quiet of a drawn blade. Within Whitmore House, civility resumed its polished mask, Yet the balance of power had shifted in ways no one could ignore. Eliza was no longer confined to the attic. The door remained unlocked, though the corridor beyond still felt like contested ground. Mrs. Whitmore permitted her presence at meals with a composure so exact it bordered on menace, while Clara watched with the anxious awareness of someone sensing her future recalculating itself. Eliza moved through the house with measured dignity, neither triumphant nor apologetic. The Duke's words had not rescued her, they had recognized her. That distinction mattered. She understood now that her voice carried weight beyond rafters and rumor, and that knowledge steadied her spine. Yet recognition alone could not silence society's appetite for scandal. It arrived swiftly. A letter, unsigned but damning, circulated among neighboring households, implying that Eliza had engineered her seclusion to entrap His Grace's sympathy. The phrasing was cunning, echoing the earlier accusations with refined cruelty. Whispers rekindled. Invitations previously withheld were now replaced with cautious curiosity. Mrs. Whitmore received visitors whose condolences were laced with scrutiny. Eliza discovered the rumor not through confrontation but through absence. A neighbor who had once exchanged pleasantries now crossed the street rather than meet her gaze. Clara, pale and shaken, confessed what she had overheard. "They say you sought to compromise him," she murmured, shame and fear intertwined. "Mama insists it is jealousy speaking, yet she does not deny it." Eliza felt the old chill attempt to reclaim her. For a fleeting moment she considered retreat, imagining the attic as refuge rather than prison. But retreat would confirm the narrative others composed for her. She refused to be rewritten. Across the fields, the Duke received a copy of the anonymous letter delivered with ostentatious discretion. He read it once, expression unreadable, then summoned his steward. "Truth does not tremble under inquiry," he said evenly. "Falsehood often does." He began to ask questions, not broadly but precisely, about the dismissed footman who had left Whitmore service weeks before the ballroom incident. Coincidences rarely endured scrutiny. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore arranged a charitable ball at Whitmore House, declaring it a gesture of resilience in the face of malicious gossip. The invitation extended pointedly to Ashbourne Hall. She believed spectacle would restore control. If the Duke appeared beside Clara beneath her chandeliers, speculation would dissolve into certainty. Eliza learned of the event through overheard instructions to the staff. Her pulse quickened, not with anticipation but resolve. If she were to endure another public judgment, she would do so standing, not hidden. She selected a gown of understated ivory, unadorned save for a narrow ribbon at the waist. It was neither defiant nor submissive. It was honest. The evening arrived luminous and tense. Candles multiplied light across polished floors. Violins tuned with expectant precision. Guests entered carrying the sharp fragrance of winter air and sharper curiosity. Mrs. Whitmore greeted them with poised warmth, Clara radiant yet strained at her side. A hush rippled through the ballroom when the Duke was announced. He entered alone. His attire was formal, his expression composed, yet there was an unmistakable gravity in his bearing. He bowed to Mrs. Whitmore with impeccable courtesy before allowing his gaze to sweep the room. It settled upon Eliza, who stood near the edge of the crowd, neither concealed nor displayed. Whispers stirred like restless silk. Mrs. Whitmore recovered swiftly. "Your Grace honors us," she declared. "We trust the evening shall dispel unfortunate misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings seldom dissipate," he replied calmly. "They are either corrected or perpetuated." The orchestra hesitated, uncertain whether to begin. The Duke stepped forward, his voice carrying without strain. "Before the first note is played, I request a moment's attention." Conversation ceased entirely. "A letter has circulated," he continued, holding a folded page between his gloved fingers, "suggesting that Miss Whitmore sought to secure my regard through manipulation." His tone remained measured, but beneath it lay steel. "I have examined its claims. I have examined their source." Mrs. Whitmore's composure flickered. "The allegations originate," he said, "from a former servant dismissed shortly before the original accusations against Miss Whitmore. Under inquiry, he has confessed to fabricating both narratives at the encouragement of one who feared losing advantageous prospects." Gasps fractured the silence. He did not name Mrs. Whitmore directly, he did not need to. Her stillness betrayed her more eloquently than accusation. Eliza felt the room pivot around her, the axis of shame shifting toward revelation. Yet triumph eluded her. What she felt instead was clarity. The truth, once spoken, required no ornament. Mrs. Whitmore attempted recovery. "Surely your Grace does not imply—" I imply nothing, he interrupted gently. I state fact. He turned toward Eliza then, closing the distance between them beneath the suspended glitter of chandeliers. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice softening without losing strength, society has spoken often about you. It is time society heard from you. Every eye in the room fixed upon her. Eliza's heartbeat thundered, yet her expression remained serene. She stepped forward, meeting the collective scrutiny with unwavering gaze. I have sought neither pity nor advantage, she said clearly. I sought only to be believed when I spoke truth. If that ambition is considered transgression, I shall bear it. Silence followed, heavy and transformative. The Duke extended his hand, not as spectacle but invitation. Then allow me to stand beside you, he said, audible to all. She placed her gloved fingers in his. The orchestra, uncertain yet compelled, began to play. As they moved across the floor, not in hurried display but in deliberate grace, the room watched its hierarchy rearrange itself. Mrs. Whitmore stood rigid, her authority unraveling thread by thread. Clara's eyes brimmed with something like relief. And as the dance drew them into the center of the ballroom, the Duke leaned close enough that only Eliza could hear him. This, he murmured, is merely the beginning. The weeks following the ballroom revelation passed with the peculiar rhythm of lives remade. Whitmore House, once a theater of whispered malice, gradually settled into a fragile civility. Eliza moved freely through its corridors, her presence no longer subversive but quietly commanding. She resumed her music, each note a testament to resilience, her fingers tracing familiar keys with the precision of memory and the freedom of self-possession. Sunlight streamed through the attic windows, the beams she had once regarded as prison bars now conduits of warmth. The Duke's visits became more frequent, though always deliberate and measured. He arrived unannounced under plausible pretenses, estate matters, inquiries about neighboring lands, but never without intention. Each encounter was a careful dance of conversation, observation, and subtle challenge. He did not rush her into gratitude or confession. Instead, he offered acknowledgement without imposition, creating a space in which she could reclaim her voice entirely. He remained distant in appearance but intimate in attention, the contrast sharpening their connection with unspoken tension. Even Clara, once the pivot of her mother's manipulations, began to see the quiet strength in Eliza. No jealousy stirred in her, only awe tempered with residual fear. Mrs. Whitmore, on the other hand, withdrew into careful composure, her social maneuvers blunted by exposure and the Duke's unwavering scrutiny. The household itself seemed suspended between two realities, the superficial order maintained by decorum, and the deeper truth now impossible to deny. One afternoon, as light fell low through the attic windows, the Duke returned carrying a small leather-bound volume. Eliza, aware of his approach yet not expecting attention, looked up to meet his gaze. There was no preamble, no formal acknowledgement of prior revelations. Instead, he handed her the book with a simple motion, his expression unreadable. I believe this belongs to you, he said softly, though I have preserved it only because it once bore a message that demanded notice. Eliza took the volume and opened it, discovering her original letter carefully preserved within its pages. Her breath caught at the sight. The ink, faint but unbroken, had weathered both time and neglect. The gesture was quiet, intimate, and deliberate, more profound than any public declaration could be. Your Grace, she murmured, I thought it lost forever. Some truths, he replied, find their way back to those who are prepared to receive them. The room held a tension that was neither urgent nor frivolous. In it existed acknowledgement of wrongs endured, the subtle thrill of recognition, and the fragile hope of something deeper. Eliza traced her fingers along the familiar lines, each word resurrected as though it had been waiting for this moment. She felt the full measure of her isolation, the quiet endurance, and the sudden, terrifying possibility of mutual understanding. Evenings that followed were spent in muted intimacy. Walks along the garden paths, conversations in the soft glow of candlelight, glances exchanged over the spines of books and the tips of gloves. The Duke's presence was both grounding and provocative. He inspired caution yet demanded honesty. Eliza found herself revealing facets of thought and emotion she had long buried. Her doubts, her aspirations, her understanding of the world constrained by both circumstance and society's expectation. And in return, she glimpsed his own restraint, the careful architecture of feeling behind the veneer of nobility. The final trial of dignity came not through scandal but choice. A proposal, inevitable yet unspoken, hovered between them like the autumn mist in the gardens. It demanded courage, the courage to claim a public identity after months of private endurance, the courage to declare affection that could withstand scrutiny, and the courage to forgive the small cruelties inflicted by circumstance. The Duke, for all his social power, waited as if understanding that love pressed into perfection when consent was freely given, rather than seized through expectation. The evening chosen was quiet and deliberate. The garden stretched into soft twilight, roses brushing along stone paths, their scent delicate yet insistent. Fireflies rose in hesitant swarms, the air itself trembling with anticipation. Eliza arrived alone, her gown simple, ivory trimmed with pale ribbon. She walked with steady composure, aware of the Duke waiting beneath an ancient arbor, the fading light catching the curve of his profile. In that moment, there existed neither servant nor scandal, neither rumor nor artifice, only two individuals drawn together by truth, recognition, and time's careful passage. He approached without flourish. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice low enough to be shared only between them, "you once questioned whether your voice was heard. I assure you, it has altered the course of my own life. Your presence has been more formidable than any proclamation society could issue." Eliza met his gaze, steady yet vulnerable. "And if I were to be found wanting?" she asked softly. "If the world's judgment proves relentless?" He smiled, a slow, deliberate expression carrying both warmth and gravity. "Then I shall oppose it, not with grand declarations but with constancy. I require nothing beyond your truth, and in it I find all I seek." A silence fell, absolute and resonant. The subtle tension of years, of whispered rumors and stolen words, seemed to condense into a single point between them. The Duke knelt, not as ceremony but as solemn vow. He offered not a ring, not a flourish, but a promise carried in the gravity of his posture and the sincerity of his tone. "Will you permit me," he asked, "to demonstrate that no attic, no rumor, no circumstance could ever contain or diminish you? That even in concealment your worth remains sovereign?" Eliza's heart, tempered by endurance and sharpened by recognition, responded with quiet certainty. She extended her hand, placing it in his, and with that gesture completed the narrative of her own claim, not one written for society's consumption, but for the acknowledgement of a single, discerning heart. In that touch lay triumph, affirmation, and surrender, not to control but to truth. The garden seemed to exhale in response. Twilight deepened, the roses' colors intensified beneath the softening light, and the first stars of evening pierced the indigo sky. The letter, once lost to storm and secrecy, had returned to its author, carried not by chance but by the deliberate patience of a man who had understood it. It rested now, preserved in the intersection of trust and recognition, a silent witness to their convergence. Mrs. Whitmore, having observed from the house at a discreet distance, recognized defeat without spectacle. The social currency she had attempted to manipulate had been rendered inert by authenticity, by courage, and by the unwavering attention of the Duke. Clara, witnessing the quiet triumph, understood the dimensions of grace and strength she herself had yet to learn. The Duke and Eliza stood beneath the arbor for a final moment before darkness fully claimed the garden, their hands joined, their gazes steady. Words were no longer necessary. Each understood that the trials endured, the rumors, the confinement, the calculated isolation, had forged a bond deeper than social expectation, more resilient than circumstance. In the stillness, the world's judgment felt simultaneously present and irrelevant. Finally, he released her hand, placing the preserved letter in her palm. "This," he said, "reminds you that truth, when sustained, is never lost, and that even when hidden, your voice commands acknowledgement." Eliza folded it carefully, feeling the weight not as burden but as testament. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting both relief and unspoken joy. "Then I shall endeavor," she said softly, "never to doubt that I exist beyond rumor or shadow." He inclined his head, the faintest trace of a smile curving his lips. "Existence, Miss Whitmore, has never been the question. Recognition, however, is now assured." As darkness settled, the garden around them seemed to hum with quiet applause. Every rose, every firefly, every stone path bore witness to the culmination of endurance and fidelity, of truth sustained against circumstance. The attic, once a symbol of exile, no longer defined her. The storm that had carried her words into the unknown had given birth to a possibility neither she nor society could have predicted. And as they turned together toward the house, the future awaiting them in shared silence, the letter rested in her hand, a fragment of past trials transformed into promise. Beyond the walls of Whitmore House, beyond the whispers and expectations, they stepped forward into the certainty of mutual regard, the final barrier of secrecy dissolved at last, yet the narrative of their lives still shimmering with infinite potential.